So we are talking here about common challenges, all right? We've got a very good panel. I will introduce them one by one across the way. If you need any help knowing who they are, you've got the booklet, or just put up your hand and we'll tell you who they are. I don't think we need to, we can dispense with the niceties. I believe we have Rafael who will start. Where es el primero? Okay. Rafael Gustavo, who's come from Venezuela. I'll request him to speak. Si quieres subir al podio.
Distinguidos embajadores, representantes de las embajadas, distinguidos miembros del International Center Conference, muchas gracias a todos, estimadas y estimados todos. Voy a dar lectura a mi conferencia que lleva como título Democracy and Intercultural Dialogue, Shared Experience. India and Latin America have a rich history of democratic experience, with potential derivate of dialogue between this region and the global South in general. India is the most popular democracy in the world and the oldest in the global South, and Latin America is the most democratic region in the global South. From a historical perspective, India and Latin America region, their citizenship practice of coexisting a difference in the village and peasant community, as well as a libertarian paradigm in recent time. Democracy is an open public space for dialogue and communication, where citizens build collective life and harmonize individual projects with the right of identity with a social community. It's the democratic spirit that forms the collective consequence. The essential element of democracy is the public reasoning of the deliberate dimension of democracy, represented in the exercise of assemblies. The government institution elect and regulate by citizen control and laws are contemporary historical elements of democracy, while public reasoning is found in the origin and the first expression of democracy. Public reasoning promotes the freedom of self-determination and is the first instance of self-government, since citizens can influence the opinion relay of the public affairs. The idea of community is based on public reasoning, and particular interest can be exposed, making citizens interested in matter of the res publica. Close? Thank you. It contributes to the essence of democratic culture, which is the recognition of the other and of the formation of the will in the public experience. That is the experience and political evaluation of public opinion, which is the maximum expression of the civil society. It also fosters a mutual understanding and is seen in value as an accessory and discutive phenomenon of democracy. As Sen pointed out, pluralism and the diversity of the doctrine are central to the public culture of democracy, and the ideal of public debate is fundamentally linked to two social practices: the acceptance of the agreement as a disagreement and the reconfiguration that is possible than learn from others. Public debate plays a crucial role in the social viability of idea formation. India has one of the oldest histories of public reasoning. As least since the Valley period, political assemblies were common of the subcontinent. Ancient India developed important democracy institutions such as those of self-government, Panchayat, and caps, and kind of bicameral assembly, Consumit and Samba, whose function included electing the king and discussing state issues, and where the Rajan had the meet with the Karnuman, or warriors, and intellectual prize, and the mercenary administration. Additional, in the Rigved, the oldest text of the Vedic tradition, terms such meeting and commit are found. Reference is also made to the term Rajan, who more than a king was posed as a leader, who was elected and could be removed. Some original culture of Latin America were also going to share this vocation of community and deliberation process. For example, for the Maya, the word like corresponds to us today. But the Maya has an additional meaning since it includes living in community, working together, sharing the same needs, and having common problems. And in the Popol book, the community book, Popol has the meaning of meeting of common house, with the story of the creation of the world and man. It lays the foundation for respect for the life and the community, and is dwelling the environment and the other living thing. The Maya also have the Popol Na, institution that serve as a community. A school for children, young and adults, where solutions to the problem and needs of the people were sought, and life and culture were discussed. But the potential contribution of Indian and Latin America to the liberative dimension of democracy are not only based on the long history, but also on their quality of plurality and cultural diversity, which allow its true intercultural process with a reliable and paradigmatic sense in the development of worldwide in both regions. Interculturalism is a non-hierarchical horizontal dialogue process, a political and ethical moment of recognition of others and their dignity, which point to the epistemic, political, social, and ethical project of the social construction, and which promote conflict as a generator of change in the worldfile of idea and action proposed in the future. As Fernando Bentancur pointed out, intercultural philosophy begins by dignifying context as place that provide a setting for the world and cultural place with the life practice. Intercultural philosophy represents a new paradigm. It resides in the historicity paradigm and our relationship with the historic, because it is the dialogue of culture with their memory and traditional, where humanity meets to tell their story. We generate the showing of the value of recognition of the history pluralization. Intercultural dialogue is a dialogue between history and between culture time, that validates substantial contribution from people and at the same time solid identity reference and a pioneer of the famous thesis of Maximin, unity in diversity. Additionally, public reasoning must be accompanied by mechanisms that allow the decision of this resonant, free, and inclusive deliberation to be building in become the basic public policy. Finally, the public reasoning to be politically relevant, it must be politically sensitive. That is, all citizens must have access to credible and reliable information on political affairs, and the ability to distinguish which political project will affect their well-being, and which program we will close to their conception of the public good. Public reasoning contributes to a horizontal form of political will, aimed at mutual understanding and an effective communicative consensus. The autonomy of civil society and civil self-determination are generate basic and comprehensive form of will. Therefore, for Amartya Sen, democracy is a universal value, since all human beings have good reason to consider it as a something valued and all have a reason to accept it. Its universality derives from the plurality of intrinsic virtues, such as participation and political freedom, that are essential for the good life of human beings, and that have important derivatives in freedom in general. Instrumental virtues such as guaranteeing the responsibility of government and the surrender of the account, and constitute virtues such as the intersubjective formation of value and sense of community. Public reasoning should not occur exclusively at the national level. International debate on democracy are an important force to then denaturalize injustice wrought in society and can contribute to enrich the notion of values. The political evaluation of values such as freedom and justice should not be a solitary exercise, but rather a national discursive practice with a global and local perspective. As Todorov pointed out, culture can only evolve from intercultural contact, and as Sousa warns, themes from the South imply a dystopic hermeneutic that starts from the idea that all cultures are incomplete and can be entirely by a dialogue with other cultures. Therefore, the democratic and intercultural dialogue between India and Latin America and its articulation of equivalence between the different partial projects will allow mutual intelligibility between the various available a potential experience and a space to revitalize the historical cultural possibility of the global South. India and Latin America have a significant history of democracy expression and trajectory, especially in the essential element, the deliberate dimension. This gives great potential for these two regions to foster intercultural dialogue that promote a process of indigenation which is making democracy their own in the local culture and pluralize democratic ethic. Additionally, to be able to become an axis from which cooperation to protect and promote democracy in the global South can take place. Actors such as university and independent think tanks must continue to promote education and culture of intercultural dialogue with an outside state border given continuity apart from the government in power. To the historical tradition of intercultural deliberation of this region and put them in control to continue enriching them. For this, we require an action plan with tangible objective. From Los Andes University, we are willing to contribute in that direction. And it is saying we bring from the Venezuela and then the proposal for the creation by India of the Cultural Institute of India to Latin America and the Caribbean, ICELC for the acronym, as an axis of dialogue with that guarantee education and cultural and official strategy that contribute to the conjectural actor and being an example of contribution and presence of India in our America. Our respect and your extensive gratitude to the ICCC for carrying out this important initiative and meeting here in India. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I should have mentioned before that unfortunately, a very good friend and almost a mentor to Rafael and me in Venezuela, Professor Hernan Lucena, could not attend because he's unwell. He's going through a surgery. But very interesting concept of development and democracy. I remember in when I was in Venezuela at the University of Mérida, we had discussed the democracy of development and the development of democracy in the context of India and Latin America, which we'll leave for another time. We don't have time today. I pass you on to Siddharth Varadarajan, who's better known as The Wire.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhojwani. And I'll just plunge straight in because we don't have time beyond 10 minutes. It's tempting when addressing a grand theme like what India and Latin America share as far as challenges and concerns go, to focus on all the commonalities and proceed on the basis of our internal commonalities to then figure out what's common in terms of challenges, concerns, etc. I thought it would be useful to start slightly differently, which is to actually note at the outset what Latin America and India do not have in common. Because I think we need to understand a very different space from which these two regions confront the world. And India, as you know, is part of South Asia. South Asia is arguably the one region of the world that has performed most poorly as far as regional integration is concerned. And that's obviously very salient in making a comparison with Latin America, because the one difference between Latin America and India is that, barring a few exceptions, and often that tends to be linked to nature of governments and nature of political personalities in Latin America. Most of the Latin American states have good to excellent relations with each other. even if not at the political level, but certainly that doesn't affect travel, trade, people-to-people contact. So Latin America as a geopolitical space coheres much better and is a very strong positive that all the countries of Latin America can point to in the ledger, when trying to assess and trying to discuss and examine and explore their place in the world. India comes from a very different neighborhood. I don't want to go into too many details, but the fact is that there isn't much by way of region that India can draw upon and harness, and that's, I think, an important difference between the two. And I think, secondly, it's just the way international geopolitics is playing out, that in the next decade or two, a key difference between India and Latin America will be that the Latin American region will mostly be on the sidelines of all the major emerging geopolitical conflicts on the Eurasian landmass and arguably even in the Asia-Pacific, although the Asia-Pacific/Indo-Pacific does touch the west coast of Latin America, but the fact is that all the conflicts are much further to the east of that. And India, on the other hand, finds itself squarely in the middle of a region where the big ticket geopolitical, I wouldn't say conflicts, but certainly contradictions are playing themselves out. US-Russia, US-China, India-China is itself a factor, and Russia-Japan, China-Japan, Taiwan. These are very much part of the wider geopolitical landscape that we find ourselves in, and that surely will color and affect. It has to affect any discussion we have on how India and Latin America can deal with common challenges and common concerns. Having marked these two items of a difference, as it were, let me turn to what India and Latin America do share and ought to share. There is an element of the normative here, because if you talk to any person, depending on where they come from, they would have a very different checklist of what they believe are common concerns and challenges. Businessmen, for example, will have their own view. Politicians of the left and right would have their own view, and social people involved in social movements, journalists, etc. So this is really my very own personal checklist, as it were, wearing the hat of a journalist, but also the hat of an analyst who's been looking at international affairs and India, Latin American affairs for the last 2 or 3 decades. And I think the first challenge that really stares us in the face is the need to develop new positions based on a common understanding of sovereignty, international law, questions of the use of force, the big questions that today seem to be all up in the air after not just Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but I would say the treatment of Palestine by Israel, to which the world is turning a blind eye, or the continuing blockade of Cuba, which even after Trump, Biden shows no signs of abandoning, and various other problems, global problems that are testing the limits of what has been so far a fairly stable and common understanding of sovereignty and international law. And I would say a very specific challenge for India and Latin America would be how to look at a world where you are seeing increasing big power rivalry, or to use the language of an earlier era, inter-imperialist rivalry, or perhaps the current era too. How do you deal with the reality of big power or inter-imperialist rivalry where you are able to engage and mitigate and ameliorate conflict, increasing the space for the rest of the world to maneuver non-alignment or active non-alignment, while at the same time not getting drawn in to either camp or the other. And this is a very fine line. I believe India and many Latin American countries think they are doing this in the way they have responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where they have decidedly, in the main, chosen not to take part in the US and West European-led sanctions regime against Russia, and have continued to engage economically as well as politically. This is certainly true of Africa too. So the rest of the world is looking at the Ukraine war rather differently. But again, I would say if there is any erring, it is also, there's a certain overcompensation as far as an unwillingness to actually be honest and upfront with our Russian friends about the unacceptability of what they've done in terms of international law, in terms of sovereignty, whatever the history or provocation or background. It is not acceptable in the 21st century that a country can resort to war in order to impose its way on a sovereign nation. And I think that finding the way in which India and Latin America can articulate a principled position when it comes to interstate relations, when it comes to defending the sovereignty of countries and peoples, without necessarily burning your bridges with the big powers that are doing the bad stuff, whether it be Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, or the US vis-a-vis Cuba, or the US and Israel, et cetera, vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I think this is a challenge which calls for not just nimble-footedness at the tactical level, but I think a deeper strategic understanding of how the world needs to accord importance to sovereignty and international law. I think this is the first point I would flag. Running quickly through the other two, climate change and climate action is a very obvious common concern and challenge, and it's a very important and wonderful that Brazil has now dealt itself back into the equation. And I would say that this is a very obvious and potentially fruitful area of cooperation. I would say the quest for global economic and financial stability is another area where India and Latin America could do a lot more. The fact that India is part of two groupings, the rather dormant / moribund IBSA, and BRICS, which is also in a way moribund given kind of current geopolitical realities. But BRICS continues to exist, and it's a potentially vibrant forum for discussion, constrained, of course, by the fact that many of the BRICS members they pay lip service to the idea of having active civil society. And you cannot, in this era, hope to have strong, an effective multilateral engagement of this kind, say through BRICS, unless you have genuine discussion and debate in civil society, between civil society players, not a stage-managed kind of dialogue that is officially sanctioned and promoted, but actual engagement, which sadly we don't see. But the potential is great. There's some incipient talk, for example, in terms of currencies of the 5 Rs, rupee, real, ruble, renminbi, and the rand, and the role that they could play, at least among themselves. There's talk of resolving all existing difficulties as far as the use of digital payments are concerned. So there's, I think, plenty to be done on the financial side. Last 2 points, which comes back to my emphasis on the central role of civil society. I think a common concern for both Latin America and India and the wider Indian South Asian region is to ensure freedom of speech and freedom of press. You can't, the fact is that you can't hope to build strong, enduring and effective and mutually beneficial relations if internally you weaken yourself by not ensuring freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So the important elements of democratic society, these are not encumbrances. Rulers may sometimes look upon them as a problem, as an encumbrance, but the fact is that these strengthen countries and deepen their ability to actually engage with one another in a meaningful way. And the final point, apart from freedom of press and ensuring it, is to ensure that you have excellence of research and excellence of universities. And a central part of this is to have autonomy. The fact is that many of the ideas that governments are engaging with today, BRICS, IBSA, on climate, etc., were first incubated in think tanks and in universities, and often in public universities by scholars who had spent many years doing research on problems. And it's when these ideas incubate and germinate at that level that then they become important for governments to pick up on and to build international cooperation on. But unless you can ensure the continuing vibrant nature and the autonomy of your university system and your research system, that powerhouse of idea generation and being able to deepen your knowledge and understanding simply won't exist. And what you will then have is a very, very formalistic, top-down kind of attempt to deal with common challenges without the infusion of fresh ideas from below. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. Short and powerful. There's lots over here that we need to talk about, and I hope we will have the time, at least for the audience. As for me, I'd like to call you out to a drink sometime and talk about these things further. Without further ado, I think it's Dr. Gangopadhyay's turn. Please. We all know that Aparajita Gangopadhyay here is running a very important Latin American center in Goa University. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhojwani. At the outset, I would like to thank the ICCR as well as the IIC for this marvelous opportunity. I wish we had more time and more panels to speak on in modern contemporary Latin America. Having said that, just a little bit of introduction, and then I'll, as all my other colleagues have jumped into the thing, I will also try and jump into it. So as you know that India and Latin America have had very good and cordial relations from the time India became independent. For example, their own struggle of colonization, for example, made them value India's fight for independence. Although the relationship was largely rhetorical because of the ideological differences where India was located and where the countries of the Latin America were located during the Cold War. So both of them remained on the two ends of the spectrum, if you want to say that. Including to that, there were other issues that were raised of distances, of language, of absence of trading lines, etc., etc. And also we didn't see too much of interaction between the governments on both sides during this period. Except for a few of the issues which emerged in the very beginning of India's independence, like the issue of Kashmir, later of Goa, and then the issue of Khalistan. I think they were basically very good relations without much depth to it. In fact, Pandit Nehru had once said, distances, physical distances have become distances of the mind. So that was very important. But in the 21st century now, a lot of scholars, a lot of writers are talking about the fact that there is a paradigm shift between India and Latin America. And in that sense, I thought I would just try to look and see if there has been any significant shift that one can identify and say, yes, you see, there is a major shift. And in this, what I try to do is in my paper, I would try to break it into two parts. One part would be politico-economic shifts, and the other one would be a cultural, people-to-people kind of linkages. In this, the first one, if you look at the politico-economic linkages, there are certain things that are evident. The first evidence is that no longer has India, for example, looking at the Latin American countries from the perspective of the larger countries only. So we are not looking at only Brazil, we are not looking at only Argentina, not looking at only Chile, we are not looking at only Mexico. But in the middle of that, we have a lot of other smaller countries that are playing a significant role. For example, many a times as students of international relations, we talk about visits from one side to the other side. And these visits, the more they become in vogue, the more they are considered to be the other region to be significant. And if you see in the last couple of years, there has been a larger increase in terms of the visits, the bilateral visits from both sides. If you look at from India's side, you have the Vice President, you have the Minister or Foreign Minister, you have the Minister of State, you have even the Prime Minister on occasions visiting this region. And from the other side, you have presidents and prime ministers from many of the regions, many of the countries visiting India. So if this is a sign of a change, perhaps there is a change. Also, the countries that we are now, I think India is identified, are not the countries of the traditional focus LAC. in 1997 that came up with all the 8 countries and focus LAC. But now you see so many smaller countries that are part of this. So you have countries like Costa Rica, Colombia, Paraguay, Cuba, Ecuador, El Salvador, all of them, some issue agenda that has been identified in these regions that can benefit both the sides. I think that is we see a significant shift there. So it's not many years ago I was presenting a paper and I was always talking about the fact that India's Latin America policy seems to be, Brazil policy seems to be India's Latin America policy. I mean, we don't look anything beyond Brazil as though everything is settled with Brazil and it is settled with Latin America, but that is not true anymore. Now you are seeing different countries being identified for different reasons throughout the subcontinent and a half. I mean, the morning Ambassador Vishwanathan was talking about the trade. I mean, if you look at the different places that he's talking about trade, they are no longer about trade to a specific country, but trade to different parts of Latin America. For example, also the fact that the G20 countries are as part of G20 countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico and Chile are close partners with India in many initiatives. For example, the International Solar Alliance, which most countries are partner to, or the fact that the Tejas aviation light aircraft that I think Argentina is planning to purchase from India, the issues on Antarctica, all of these are things that are not part of the traditional India-Latin America relationship that we have talked in the past. With Mexico too, a whole bunch of agreements have been signed on a number of issues, and I will not go into that. But I think another place that has opened the relationship to for far more engagements probably has been the pandemic itself. I think the vaccine diplomacy and India's rolling out vaccines at the right time and the kind of medical health care that I think has brought in a different kind of a perspective to India-Latin America relations. Also, for example, countries like Ecuador, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, then countries like Panama and Guatemala, they may not be doing that much of trade with India, but nonetheless they have become destinations for Indian exports and investments, and especially in the IT sector. I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact about people to people. I think one issue that I always talk about is that I think the way we look at Latin America, I think that is I have a problem with that, because we always talk about India, Latin America. One is a country, the other is a continent and a half. So we don't take into we don't take it very seriously when we talk about the specificities, the particularities of a particular country. So I think that needs to be highlighted somewhere or taken into serious consideration when we talk about India, Latin America. All of Latin America is not one. Just the way. So I think that is one problem that I've always had. I think that is we need to look into that matter. Another thing is that I mean, we had yesterday so many papers talking about diaspora. I think we have never taken account of our diaspora that emerges out of Latin America. We take a great significance, importance of diaspora in the United States, in United Kingdom, in Europe, in Australia, elsewhere, but we don't take into importance the diaspora. And I mean, that is my personal opinion, is that we need to do more in terms of the cultural centers that we have. It is perfectly fine when you teach them Mahabharata, dancing and music and everything else, but India is a modern country. I think that needs to get reflected in our cultural centers and in our embassies. All this, the total number of embassies have gone up. That is fine. It's great. You have more people-to-people contact. Another place that I think we need to have some kind of importance is higher education. I think if you look at the kind of agreements that higher education institutions in India have with different higher education institutions in different parts of Latin America, you will realize that most of these initiatives are individual initiatives. So I go somewhere, I meet somebody, and then if we work out an MOU between two institutions. I think something needs to be done beyond that. A sort of a registry could be maintained of the institutions that are there and with whom they have agreements, so that the other universities can benefit from both sides. I think that is another important thing that needs to be looked into. Finally, I think in terms of the diaspora, also when you do a cursory look at the Pravasi Bharatiya Sanman given on the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the number of Sanman given to the people coming out of Latin America, despite the large diaspora, is very few. I mean, I sat and did a sort of a calculation, and it was pretty poor. It was pretty poor compared to the ones that are given from say, other parts of the world. I think that is one more thing that we can do. I think the government is trying to identify Latin America as a place of tourism, of cinemas, etc., which is fantastic. I think the more linkages we have through people to people, I think that is more important. One thing I also wanted to say, that in the case of the economic cooperation, or in the case of say when we talk about soft power like cuisine, food, dance, cricket, I think Bollywood, none of them have that kind of strong initiative or support of the government. I think that even the economic cooperation that we have has been always a private venture. It's a private company, private initiatives that have taken by different companies in Latin America. I think that is one place that we are, I think we are lacking. Another place, as I said, that when we talk about Bollywood, the government did not push Bollywood there. Bollywood went by itself, and it's experimenting, music, food, cuisine, whatever they are doing, cricket, all of them they have done by themselves. I recently saw a video of Shri Ravi Shankar in Buenos Aires. I mean, the kind of support that he has in Buenos Aires is awesome. I think we could do something more in a structured fashion to carry this forward. I think that is very important. Do I have any more time?
I'm afraid.
Okay.
I'd love to let you go on this fascinating.
Okay. I'll just finish 1 minute. Okay, so I think one thing that I learned when I had gone to Argentina a few years ago, that they said to me that we have to move from being only primary commodity producing countries to something else. So if they told me in Cordoba, for example, that what do we do if nobody buys our soya? So I think the fear of deindustrialization, the fear of of that is, I think, what they see vis-a-vis India. That is, I think, one of the major challenges that I perceive that exists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparajita. Apologize for the exigencies. And now I'll just pass on to Dr. Varun Sahni. Varun, please. You all, I think, know that he's been Vice Chancellor of Jammu University and Goa University, and has married a Mexican in the process.
Not in the process. Completely incidental. Well, thanks so much for that, Ambassador Bhojwani, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Inspired by Siddharth, I'll do this sitting down. And I was intending to sort of, hit upon 3 points and 2 thoughts. But given the paucity of time, I'll restrict myself to 2 points and 2 thoughts. The point I'm dropping is about the Indo-Caribbean, so it's a bit sad that we are short of time, but that's the nature of the beast. So the first sort of point is this. Talking about problems, it seems to me that contemporary global problems come in 3 different types. But this typology is often ignored by us. We tend to conflate these problems and thereby confuse them. So what is the sort of typology I suggest? I think the first type of problem are really new problems that the world is confronting either for the first time. Anthropogenic climate change would be an example of that, or for the first time in a globalized form. And obviously out here, epidemics and pandemics sort of, now are sort of a prime example of that. And, for these types of problems, the solutions necessarily require ingenuity, the ability to think out of the box, novel approaches, because quite simply, we're encountering them for the first time. But we have a second type of problem, and those are old problems. And here I'm thinking about world trade, urbanization, energy and availability, resource scarcity. So these are old problems that require new approaches because the old approaches no longer work. And out here, in many of the cases, many of these problems, renewed emphasis on multilateralism could actually find ways of, coming up with new solutions to these problems. And there is then a third type of problem, a global problem. And this third type is old problems with old solutions but new actors. And here we actually encounter a range of traditional security issues: sea lanes of communication, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism. These are old problems. We know what the solutions are, but the actors are new. And here, I think the real reality is being impacted by the ongoing hegemonic decline, the power transition that we are now seeing in the international system. All of these become very germane in this context. So when we think then about what the common problems are between India and the countries in Latin America, I think we need to sort of figure out what are the sorts of problems that we can most fruitfully collectively address. So for instance, if you're thinking about sea lanes of communication, it's a sort of a problem which necessarily would involve only a few state actors in Latin America. So that was my first kind of broad point. The second is to sort of look at it not so much as problems, but at actors themselves. Now, in international politics, states get together, states come together either to aggregate their power, or to solve common problems, or to build community, or sometimes a combination of these three motivations, right? Now, power aggregation, frankly, is not really anywhere in the picture when you're thinking about India and Latin America. The last instance we have of power aggregation is, in fact, when India and Brazil both fought on the side of the Allied powers during the Second World War, when India was still a British colony. I mean, since then, we do not exactly have an instance of power aggregation. And about common problems, Siddharth's already spoken about that, and so have I. So the question really becomes, to some extent, it seems to me, the question about building community. And that, I think, is something that we probably need to focus on a bit. Now, what's the core challenge today for all states in the international system? If I had to sort of put it in one sentence, this is what the sentence would be. It's enhancing our strategic autonomy, which means an ability to take our own decisions from our own perspectives, sharpening our competitive edge, and preserving our unique identity in a world that is ever more interconnected, interdependent, and interpenetrated. So, and I don't have time to actually go and talk about what the differences are between interconnection, interdependence, and interpenetration, although I'd be happy to do so in some other universe, I guess. Now, the thing is this. This formulation assumes that, this is the way the bigger states in the system, the key powers in the system would view the system. But I would argue that, in fact, there is a curse of size here. And in fact, there are distinct advantages of being small. And the biggest advantage in strategic terms that you can have if you're a small state is that you have the opportunity, the possibility of specializing, which, if you are a large state, is not an option open to you. So, this formulation may seem to be a formulation, coming from a kind of a big power perspective, but I would assure you that it isn't at all. And that challenge of strategic autonomy exists exactly as much in fact, in some ways, in a more profound way, for the smaller states in the system. And this is important in the context of Latin America, because so many of the states of Latin America are smaller states, as it is for the larger players in the system. Now, in most of India's foreign policy history, Latin America has featured only sporadically and symbolically. And in my writings on this theme, I've sort of suggested that India's policy towards Latin America has gone through three distinct phases. The first was a phase basically that I call the phase of distant acquaintance, which was from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, or the Nehruvian years. The second phase is what I call the phase of rhetorical solidarity, which were really in some ways the years of non-aligned revisionism, which were the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s. And since then, really the phase of strategic engagement, coinciding with India's emergence as a player with system-shaping potential, and we're really talking from the mid-1990s onwards. And here, what I want to suggest is that if you were to actually coldly analyze India's relations with different states in Latin America, we must come to the conclusion that most of these relationships are not strategic but transactional. Now, please don't view transactional as a pejorative term. You know, I mean, international life is about exchange relations. I have bread, you have butter, take some of my bread, give me some of your butter, we can both have sandwiches, is a very good way to lead life. And we should not see international life as being necessarily a struggle of life and death all the time. Trade is in fact a much more powerful metaphor of international life than is war, which is why when something like Ukraine happens, it horrifies all of us. Whereas, you know, trade happens on a normal and regular basis and barely hits the headlines. So you know, when it comes to strategic relations, and here I am, unfortunately, in disagreement with my colleague Aparajita. I believe that for a long time, the only country in Latin America with which you could have claimed that India had strategic relations was Brazil. And now, as a result of the G20 presidency and the proactive way in which India is approaching its G20 presidency, which I personally really applaud, what is happening is that at least now we can see you know, the bilateral relations between India and Mexico and India and Argentina you know, also rising to that kind of strategic level. So we have to begin to think, and I think this is as much a task for the analytical community as it is for the policy community, that what would it really mean to think about strategic relations between India and Latin America. Now, you know, out here I think an emphasis on community building, on trying to build a community of knowledge and empathy becomes really important. And I, for one, have been, you know, I'm surprised at how moved I am by India's G20 presidency, because I'm quite a cynical academic otherwise, right? So, you know, I mean, this whole notion, you know, coming from the, you know, okay, time's over, almost. Then I won't tell you about how moved I am by India's G20. And I'm dropped the next point. The two thoughts to wrap this up. I believe that the relations between India and Latin America are still really largely about serendipitous encounters. And you know, at least some of us have had our, shall we say, spousal realities, you know, factored in by those serendipitous encounters. But let me give you one that's not personal. One of the greatest sports persons our country, India, has produced is Commander Abhilash Tomi, who about 70 hours ago, he's in the you know, in the Golden Globe race, which is a sailing race around the world, circumnavigating. About 70 hours ago, he rounded Cape Horn from west to east. He was trying to decide whether he was going to go, you know, with the Malvinas to his starboard or to his port. I think he decided it's going to his port. So now he's sailing up. He's number 2 right now in that race. When he was navigating those southern waters, if he ever was in difficulty, he would have called upon, before he rounded the Horn, the Chilean Navy, and after he rounded the Horn, the Argentine Navy. So, you know, I mean, let's not underestimate the power of those encounters. And I think for you know, in the context of India and Latin America, my last thought, and I'm literally wrapping it up here. I love this conference, and I really thank IIC and ICCR for organizing it. I'm a lapsed Latin Americanist. You know, I earned my doctorate on Argentina at Oxford, and then didn't ever do that. You know, I became an international relations theorist. And my talk today also, I think, reflects that to some extent. But, you know, I'm an Indian who loves Latin America. I see lots of Indians in this room who love Latin America, and see lots of Latin Americans in this room who love India. But the question I want to ask is, are we all of us eccentrics in our own lands?
With that, Varun, thank you and sorry again. I wish we had more time, but I'm going to go straight to Dr. Ash Narain Roy, who is the director of the Indian Institute of Social Sciences and a veteran Latin American analyst.
Thank you, Mr. Bhojwani. See, the last speaker has at least two challenges. I will not talk about that, but I will rather take solace in Mark Twain's word that it has one advantage. The advantage is that whatever you may say, not many would pay attention to, except when you are telling the truth. Over the last 3 days, we have reflected on the whys and wherefores of how common challenges and common concerns can be addressed. So I will kind of, talk briefly about what to do and what not to do. Today, India's footprint is evident everywhere. So is Latin America's growing presence. And that's why Octavio Paz said, this is time to dream big. And both Latin America and us are dreaming big. He said that you deserve what you dream. Merece lo que sueñas. Let me come to what are the things that we should do or not do directly. Our trade and economic exchanges have expanded manifold, but the old metrics of donor-recipient relations is not the template, because there is no one donor who only gives, and there is no one recipient who only receives. We also need to think of our policy design issue. And what I'm saying that it requires not just new imagination, but new reaffirmation. And I think this conference goes a long way in reaffirming our faith in moving forward. Latin America is hugely diverse, as we know, and all that. And that's why no single narrative, whether it is in terms of a particular foreign policy orientation, whether it is kind of, a signing trade agreement, would capture the whole essence. And that's why the policy, like what the title of a film is, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, is not the strategy. India needs new paradigms, tools as well as strategies for Latin America. Now, there can be three-pronged cooperation: horizontal, then special ties with some countries, and then cooperation, it could be kind of through the intergovernmental framework. Now, with some countries, we can have relationship which could be called a la carte. With some others, it could be privileged dialogue or strategic dialogue. And then, of course, the normal one. Now, so a couple of things that we are not doing enough, or we should be doing much more. One is, we should not be contented with what could be called linear optimism. That is, you have the trade, you increase it many times. Now, this is only the better vision of the present. So that's not enough. Second, juggling balls on a high wire is also undesirable. What we need is what is known in the business circle at the S curve. That is, slow at first and then go very fast before you slow down to a plateau. I would also say that India and Latin America should have a policy which could be called the Anna Karenina principle. That is, success is not about doing one thing correctly, but doing things to avoid many modes of failure. So that is another thing. But what we should avoid is peacock dance. That is one step forward, 2 steps backward, and a spread of feathers. So that is not done. India's benign image is a big advantage. But a lot of groundwork is required. We need a practical, or rather appropriate fit between our goals and our strategies. Do we need an affair with Latin America, that is amorio, or a serious relationship with Latin America? It's not for me to say. What I need to say is that India, rather both of us, need to avoid the pitfalls of what Toni Morrison calls beloved bore, aburrido amado. Muchas gracias, muito obrigado.
I believe we are on the on the verge of receiving the foreign minister, external affairs minister. So I'll just say a few words to thank basically the panel. It's such a pity that we don't have enough time with them, to listen to them, to interact with them. Absolutely no time for questions. I believe we've taken away what could be called the essence, or perhaps the kernel, of the challenges that confront us. They are so numerous that I ran out of ink writing this down. I shall be further interacting with the panelists. I'm sure you all could do the same through the aegis of the IIC. I believe if any one of you wants to say a last word, because we may still have a minute. No? Then I think we should call this panel concluded. Thank you all very much.